The gunshots echoed through Stockton, Nebraska, as Grace Lawson ducked behind a water trough, clutching her reticule to her chest, and praying that the chaos would end before sunset. She hadn't anticipated a bank robbery on her first day in town, but the Wild West had its own ways of welcoming newcomers. "Don't move, madam," a deep voice commanded from behind her. Grace froze, her heart pounding wildly. She slowly turned to see a tall man with piercing blue eyes and a dusty black hat shadowing his face. His stance was confident, revolver drawn but pointed at the ground. "I'm not with them," she stammered, nodding toward the commotion down the street. "I figured as much," he replied, glancing quickly at her elegant traveling dress. "You look more like someone who just stepped off the stage than a bank robber." A bullet splintered the wooden post just inches from where they crouched. The man moved swiftly, positioning himself between Grace and the gunfire, his broad shoulders creating a human shield. "Stay down. This'll be over soon," he assured her, his voice steady despite the danger. "The name's Xander Kincaid, sheriff's deputy." "Grace Lawson," she responded, her voice barely audible over the continued gunfire. "I arrived on the noon stage from Boston." Xander Kincaid nodded, his focus still on the gunfight down the street. "Welcome to Stockton. Not usually this exciting, I promise." The shooting intensified, and Grace found herself pressing closer to the deputy's back, seeking safety in his solid presence. When silence finally fell, signaling the end of the gunfight, the sun was already dipping toward the horizon. "Is it over?" she whispered. "Seems so," Xander replied, holstering his weapon. "Sheriff's got them cornered. You can come out now, Miss Lawson." Grace rose shakily to her feet, brushing dust from her skirts. As she straightened, she noticed blood seeping through Xander's sleeve. "You're hurt," she exclaimed. He glanced at his arm with mild surprise. "Just a graze. Had worse from shaving?" "Nonsense," Grace insisted, tearing a strip from her petticoat with practiced efficiency. "Let me help." As she tied the makeshift bandage around his arm, Xander studied her face. "You've done this before." "I worked as a nurse during the war," she explained, securing the knot. "I came west to start a new practice. Stockton needs a proper medical professional, according to my cousin Martha's letters." "Martha Peterson, the school teacher?" "Yes, do you know her?" A shadow crossed Xander's face. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, Miss Lawson, but Martha passed on last winter. Influenza." Grace felt her knees weaken, and Xander gently guided her to sit on a nearby barrel. "But she wrote to me just 3 months ago. We arranged everything. The clinic, my lodgings." The town kept her affairs in order, hoping a relative might come claim her things, Xander explained softly. "I reckon that's you." As this devastating news sank in, the street began filling with townsfolk emerging from their hiding places. The sheriff and his men marched 3 bound outlaws toward the jailhouse. "You've arrived at a complicated time, Miss Lawson," Xander said, helping her to her feet. "But Stockton does need a doctor, something fierce." "I'm not a doctor, just a nurse," Grace corrected him. "Though I've done more than my share of doctoring. Out here, that's more than most have seen." He tipped his hat. "Let me escort you to Martha's place. You must be tired after your journey and all this." As they walked through the dusty main street, Grace felt the stares of the townspeople. A woman traveling alone was unusual enough, a woman claiming medical knowledge even more so. "Deputy Kincaid," called a portly man hurrying toward them. "These miscreants claim there's a 4th man waiting at Miller's Creek." "I'll ride out at first light, Mayor," Xander replied. "It'll be dark soon, and tracking's impossible without daylight." The mayor nodded, then turned curious eyes to Grace. "And who might this lady be?" "This is Miss Grace Lawson, Martha Peterson's cousin from Boston. She's a nurse, come to set up practice here." The mayor's eyebrows rose appreciatively. "Is that so? Well, you're most welcome, Miss Lawson, most welcome indeed. We've been without proper medical attention since Doc Wilson moved to Kansas City last year." Grace managed a polite smile despite her exhaustion and grief. "Thank you, sir. I hope to be of service to Stockton." After brief introductions to several more townsfolk, Xander finally led her to a small but neat cabin at the edge of town. He produced a key from his pocket. "I've been checking on the place weekly," he explained as he unlocked the door. Martha was well liked here. The interior was simple but cozy. A small front room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast iron stove, and 2 doors leading to what Grace presumed were bedrooms. Everything was spotlessly clean but covered with a fine layer of dust. "It's lovely," Grace whispered, fighting tears as she recognized her cousin's hand-stitched cushions and the familiar books lining a small shelf. "There's firewood stacked out back," Xander said, moving to light a lantern on the table. "And I'll fetch you some water from the well." "Thank you," Grace replied, setting down her carpet bag. The day's events were catching up with her, a weight of fatigue and sorrow pressing down. When Xander returned with the water bucket, he found Grace standing motionless in the center of the room, tears streaming silently down her face. "Miss Lawson," he said gently, setting down the bucket, "I know it's a lot to take in. Would you like me to fetch Mrs. Holloway from next door to stay with you tonight?" Grace quickly wiped her tears, embarrassed by her display of emotion. "No, thank you, I'll be fine." Xander nodded, lighting the fire and checking the pantry. "There's some dried beans and flour here, not much else. I'll have the general store send over provisions in the morning. You're very kind, deputy?" "Just Xander is fine," he said with a slight smile. "We don't stand on ceremony much in Stockton." As he prepared to leave, dusk was settling over the town. The shadows lengthened, filling the corners of the cabin with darkness that the single lantern couldn't quite dispel. Grace glanced anxiously at the windows, suddenly aware of how isolated the cabin was. Xander paused at the door. "Is something wrong, Miss Lawson?" She hesitated, not wanting to appear foolish. "It's nothing, just an unfamiliar place." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I'll be riding out at dawn to check on that outlaw at Miller's Creek, but I can ask one of the town ladies to come stay." "No," Grace interrupted. "I'm just being silly. It's been a long day." Xander nodded, still watching her carefully. "I'll leave you this spare lantern then." He placed another oil lamp on the table and lit it from the first. "Extra oil's in the cupboard beside the stove." "Thank you," Grace whispered, oddly comforted by the additional light. With a final nod, Xander stepped outside. Through the window, Grace watched his tall figure disappear into the gathering darkness, feeling suddenly very alone in this strange town so far from everything familiar. When full darkness fell, Grace realized that Martha's cabin had no locks on the inside of the doors. She pushed a chair against the front entrance and used a broom handle to wedge the back door shut. Still uneasy, she kept both lanterns burning brightly as she unpacked her few belongings. In her cousin's bedroom, she found Martha's clothes still hanging in the wardrobe, her hairbrush still on the dressing table. It was as if she might return at any moment. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, overcome again by grief for the woman who had been more like a sister to her. After changing into her nightgown, Grace found herself unable to extinguish either lantern. The sounds of the night, so different from Boston, made her jumpy. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the wind rattled the shutters. Every creak of the cabin's timbers had her sitting bolt upright, straining to listen. It was nearly midnight when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Grace grabbed her cousin's old shotgun from beside the bed, her hands trembling as she positioned herself behind the door. "Miss Lawson." Xander's voice called softly from outside. "It's just me. Don't shoot." Grace lowered the gun, relief flooding through her. She removed the chair and opened the door to find Xander standing there, holding a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Mrs. Baker at the hotel sent over some supper when she heard you'd arrived," he explained. "I know it's late, but I thought you might be hungry." "You rode all the way back here just to bring me food?" Grace asked, touched by the gesture. "I was checking the town perimeter anyway," he said, though she suspected this wasn't entirely true. "Wanted to make sure our bank robbers didn't have friends lurking about." He glanced past her into the cabin, noting both lanterns still burning brightly. A knowing look crossed his face, but he made no comment as he handed her the food bundle. "There's bread, cheese, and some cold chicken in there," he said. "Not fancy, but it'll hold you till morning." "Won't you come in?" Grace asked, suddenly reluctant to be alone again. Xander hesitated, then nodded. Just for a moment. Inside, he removed his hat, revealing thick, dark hair. In the lamplight, Grace noticed how the day's stubble shadowed his jaw and how his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he spoke. "You kept both lanterns burning," he observed, setting his hat on the table. Grace busied herself with unwrapping the food. "I'm not used to the country darkness. In Boston, there are street lamps." "Makes sense," he replied, accepting the piece of bread she offered him. First night in a new place can be unsettling. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Grace found herself studying him when he wasn't looking the way he held himself, alert even in repose, the small scar above his right eyebrow, the strength in his hands as he broke the bread. "Why did you really come back tonight, Deputy?" she asked suddenly. Xander met her eyes. "I remembered something about Martha. She was afraid of the dark too," Grace started. "How did you—" "The lanterns," he explained. "Martha always kept at least one burning, even during the day sometimes. Said the shadows made her uneasy." "We were the same that way," Grace admitted. "As children, we'd take turns staying awake to keep the candle lit." Xander smiled. "She told me once that your grandmother used to say it wasn't the dark itself that was frightening, but what might hide within it." "That sounds like grandmother," Grace said softly. She had a gift for making perfectly reasonable fears sound even more terrifying. They shared a smile, and for a moment Grace felt less alone. "I should go," Xander said, rising. "Dawn comes early and I've got tracking to do." At the door, he turned back. "I'll check on you tomorrow evening if that's all right." "I would appreciate that," Grace replied, surprised by how much she meant it. After he left, Grace found she could extinguish one of the lanterns, keeping only the one by her bed burning through the night. She slept fitfully, dreaming of gunshots and shadowy figures and, oddly, of blue eyes watching over her. The following days passed in a blur as Grace established herself in Stockton. The townspeople were cautiously welcoming, especially after she successfully treated young Jimmy Fletcher's broken arm and Mrs. Wilson's persistent cough. Word spread quickly that the new nurse from Boston had skilled hands and a gentle manner. True to his word, Xander checked on her each evening after his duties. Sometimes he brought small gifts, fresh eggs from a farmer, wildflowers gathered on patrol, a book borrowed from the schoolhouse. Their conversations grew longer, more comfortable, ranging from their childhoods to their hopes for the future. Grace learned that Xander had come west after serving in the Union Army, seeking a fresh start like so many others. He'd been in Stockton for 5 years, working his way up from ranch hand to deputy sheriff. "I met your cousin my first week here," he told Grace one evening as they sat on her porch. "I'd gotten into a scuffle with some cowboys passing through, ended up with a knife cut on my face." He pointed to the scar she'd noticed that first night. "Martha stitched me up, lectured me about fighting, then invited me to Sunday dinner." "That sounds like Martha," Grace laughed. "Always adopting strays. Is that what I am to you, Miss Lawson, a stray?" There was something in his tone that made her heart beat faster. "No," she replied softly, "you're not a stray at all." Their eyes met, and for a moment Grace thought he might kiss her. Instead, he cleared his throat and stood. "It's getting late," he said. "I should let you get some rest." As the days turned into weeks, Grace noticed that Xander had started bringing an extra lantern when he visited, ensuring she always had enough light for the night. He never mentioned her fear directly, just quietly made sure she was comfortable. One evening in late August, nearly 2 months after her arrival, a violent thunderstorm struck Stockton. The wind howled, rattling the windows of Martha's cabin. Grace paced nervously, jumping at each crack of thunder. When a particularly fierce gust blew out both her lanterns, she nearly cried out in panic. Fumbling in the darkness, she was trying to relight them when a knock came at the door. "Grace, are you all right?" Xander's voice carried through the wood. She opened the door to find him drenched from the rain, a glowing lantern in his hand. "I thought you might need this," he said, stepping inside and hanging his dripping coat by the door. "How did you know?" she asked, taking the offered lantern gratefully. "I always know when you're afraid," he replied simply. That night, as the storm raged outside, Xander told her stories of his childhood in Pennsylvania, of his mother who sang in the church choir, of his father who could build anything with his hands. Grace shared memories of Boston, of nursing during the war, of the sister she'd lost to scarlet fever as a child. When the storm finally passed, it was nearly dawn. They had moved to sit side by side on the small settee, shoulders touching. Grace found herself fighting sleep, not wanting the night to end. "I should go," Xander said, though he made no move to stand. "You don't have to," Grace whispered, surprising herself with her boldness. Xander turned to look at her, his expression serious. "If I stay now, people will talk." "Let them," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. He smiled then, a slow, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Grace Lawson, are you trying to compromise my reputation?" She laughed softly. "Perhaps I'm trying to compromise mine." "I won't allow that," he said, taking her hand in his. "But I will ask you a question." "Yes, may I call on you properly? Not as a deputy checking on a newcomer, but as a man courting a woman he admires very much." Grace felt warmth spread through her chest. "I would like that." Xander nodded, lifting her hand to his lips. "Then I'll bid you good night, Miss Lawson, and good morning." As he rose to leave, Grace felt a sudden panic at the thought of the lantern going with him. "I'm afraid of the dark," she blurted out, embarrassed but unable to stop herself. Xander turned back, his expression soft with understanding. He set the lantern down on the table beside her. "Then I'll keep the lantern lit forever," he whispered, the promise in his words warming her more than any flame could. That morning marked a turning point in their relationship. Xander began courting Grace openly, taking her on buggy rides through the countryside, escorting her to church on Sundays, and joining her for dinner several evenings a week. The townsfolk watched with approval. Grace had proven her worth as a healer, and Xander was respected as a fair and capable lawman. They made a handsome couple, the tall, dark-haired deputy and the refined nurse with her Boston education and gentle ways. Not everyone was pleased, however. Silas Thornton, the wealthy cattle baron who owned half the county, had set his sights on Grace himself. He'd made his interest known with expensive gifts that Grace politely returned, and invitations she declined with increasing firmness. "Thornton's not used to hearing no," Xander warned after Silas confronted them outside the general store one afternoon. "Be careful when I'm not around." Grace bristled at the suggestion that she needed protection. "I handled far more dangerous men during the war, Xander. I can manage one arrogant rancher." "I don't doubt your courage," he replied, taking her hand, "but Thornton has a mean streak. He doesn't fight fair." His concern proved justified when strange incidents began occurring. Grace's medical supplies were tampered with, rumors circulated about her qualifications, and one night someone left a dead rattlesnake on her porch. Xander was furious, convinced Thornton was behind the harassment. "Let me confront him," he insisted after discovering the snake. "And then what?" "You have no proof," Grace pointed out reasonably. "Besides, I won't have you risking your position over childish pranks." But the pranks escalated. In early October, Grace was called out to a remote homestead to treat a supposedly ailing child, only to find the cabin empty. As she turned to leave, two men stepped from the shadows. "Miss Lawson," the taller one said with a mocking bow. "Mr. Thornton sends his regards." Grace backed toward her horse. "What does Mr. Thornton want?" "Just to have a conversation with you. He's waiting at his ranch house." "Then he can call on me in town like a gentleman," Grace replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Now, if you'll excuse me," the second man grabbed her arm. "That wasn't a request, madam." Grace's nursing experience had taught her how to handle difficult patients. With practiced ease, she twisted free, simultaneously driving her knee upward with considerable force. The man doubled over with a howl of pain. Before the taller man could react, she'd swung herself onto her horse and was galloping back toward Stockton, heart pounding with fear and anger. Xander was livid when she told him what had happened. "This ends now," he declared, strapping on his gun belt. "Xander, please," Grace pleaded. "Let the sheriff handle this officially." "Sheriff's on Thornton's payroll," Xander replied grimly, "has been for years." "Then we'll go to the federal marshal in Grand Island," she suggested, "or move away, start fresh somewhere else." Xander took her hands in his. "Is that what you want, to leave Stockton?" Grace hesitated. Despite everything, she'd grown to love the small town and its people. Her medical practice was thriving, and for the first time since the war, she felt truly useful. "No," she admitted, "but I don't want blood shed over me either." "I'll try reasoning with him first," Xander promised, "but this has to stop." That evening, Xander rode out to the Thornton ranch. Grace paced her cabin anxiously, jumping at every sound, keeping all 3 lanterns burning brightly against the autumn darkness. It was nearly midnight when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She rushed to the door, relief flooding through her at the sight of Xander dismounting. But as he stepped into the lamplight, she gasped. His face was bruised, his lips split and bleeding. "What happened?" she demanded, pulling him inside and immediately reaching for her medical bag. "Thornton and I had a disagreement about his manners," Xander replied dryly, wincing as she dabbed at his cut lip. "You fought him?" Grace asked, horrified. "Not exactly. I expressed my concerns, he expressed his ownership of half the county, then his men expressed themselves with their fists." Xander attempted a smile that turned into a grimace. "But I made my point," which was, that if anything happens to you, anything at all, I'll hold him personally responsible, sheriff or no sheriff, Grace sighed, setting aside the bloody cloth. "And what did he say to that?" "He said I was welcome to try." Xander's expression darkened. "Then he said something about you I won't repeat." Grace cupped his bruised face gently in her hands. "Xander Kincaid, you are the most frustrating, honorable, stubborn man I've ever known." He caught one of her hands and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Is that good or bad?" "I haven't decided yet," she replied with a small smile. "Now hold still while I clean these cuts properly." As she tended his wounds, a comfortable silence fell between them. When she'd finished, Xander caught her hand again. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box, intricately carved with a floral pattern. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment." Grace's heart skipped a beat as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl set in the center. "It was my mother's," he explained. "She gave it to me before she passed, said to save it for the woman who made me want to be a better man." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "That's you, Grace." Tears filled her eyes as he continued, "I know I'm just a deputy with little to offer, but if you'll have me—" "Yes," Grace interrupted, not needing to hear more. "Yes, Xander, I'll have you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "I promise you won't regret it. I'll build us a proper house in town, close to where you can set up a permanent clinic, and I'll keep every lantern in the county lit if that's what you need." Grace laughed through her tears. "Just one is enough as long as you're beside me." Their wedding was set for the first weekend in November. The entire town buzzed with excitement, eager for a celebration after the hardships of recent years. Even the threat of Silas Thornton seemed to recede as preparations consumed everyone's attention. Grace moved her belongings to the room above the barber shop, insisting on propriety until the wedding. Xander teased her about Boston's sensibilities but respected her wishes, though he still visited every evening to light her lantern before saying goodnight. 3 days before the wedding, a telegram arrived from the federal marshal in Grand Island. Cattle rustlers had been spotted near Stockton, and the sheriff and his deputy were ordered to investigate immediately. "I have to go," Xander told Grace reluctantly. "The marshal suspects it's the Dobbs gang. They're dangerous men." "How long will you be gone?" Grace asked, trying to hide her disappointment. 2 days at most. I'll be back in plenty of time for the wedding." He kissed her softly. "Start without me and I'll be very put out." Grace laughed, pushing away her concern. "I would never dream of it. Be careful out there. Always am." He tipped his hat with a grin. "Keep your lantern lit, darlin'. I'll be back before you know it." But 2 days passed with no sign of Xander or the sheriff. On the morning of the 3rd day, with the wedding less than 24 hours away, a rider came thundering into town. Grace was fitting her wedding dress when Mrs. Holloway burst into the room, her face ashen. "There's been trouble," the older woman said. "Sheriff's been shot. He's asking for you." Grace's heart froze. "And Xander? Where's Xander?" Mrs. Holloway shook her head. "I don't know, child. The rider didn't say." Tearing off the dress, Grace changed quickly into her working clothes and grabbed her medical bag. Outside, a crowd had gathered around a dust-covered man on horseback. "Where's the sheriff?" Grace demanded, pushing through to him. "Miller's Creek," the man replied. "About 3 hours' ride. He's bad hurt, madam." "Get me a horse," Grace ordered, turning to the livery owner, "and someone to guide me there." "I'll take you," Silas Thornton's voice cut through the murmurs. He stepped forward, already mounted on his black stallion. "My men and I were just heading out to help." Grace hesitated, suspicion flaring, but there was no time for doubt, not if the sheriff was badly wounded. "And if Xander was hurt too." "Fine," she said curtly, mounting the horse the livery owner brought. "Let's go." The ride to Miller's Creek was tense, with Thornton attempting conversation that Grace pointedly ignored. Her mind was filled with terrible possibilities, each worse than the last. When they finally arrived at the small mining settlement, they found the sheriff in the back room of the saloon, pale and sweating with a bullet wound in his chest. Grace pushed aside her personal fears and set to work, cleaning the wound and extracting the bullet with steady hands. It was only after she'd stabilized him that she allowed herself to ask the question burning in her throat. "Where is Deputy Kincaid?" The sheriff's bloodshot eyes met hers. "Dobbs took him. Said he'd trade him for his brother we've got locked up in Grand Island." Grace felt the room spin. "Took him where?" "Don't know exactly. Their hideout's somewhere in the Badlands north of here." The sheriff coughed weakly. "Marshal's sending men, but it'll be days before they arrive." "He doesn't have days," Grace whispered. Behind her, Thornton cleared his throat. "I could help Miss Lawson." She turned to him, eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why would you do that?" "Despite what you and Kincaid think of me, I'm not a monster," Thornton replied evenly. "I don't hold with kidnapping lawmen, bad for business." Grace studied his face, searching for deceit. "What would you want in return?" "Nothing." When she scoffed, he added, "Consider it a wedding present." After a moment's consideration, Grace nodded. "All right, but I'm coming too." "Absolutely not," Thornton objected. "It's too dangerous." "Xander may be injured," Grace insisted. "He'll need medical attention." "Miss Lawson." "I wasn't asking permission, Mr. Thornton." Her voice was steel. "Either I come with you or I find my own way there." Thornton's expression shifted from annoyance to reluctant admiration. "Very well, but you'll do exactly as I say when I say it." Within the hour, they were riding north with 5 of Thornton's men, all heavily armed. Grace had changed into men's trousers borrowed from the barkeep's son, reasoning that a dress would only slow her down. As they rode, Thornton explained his plan. "I know these Badlands. There are only a few places with enough water for a gang to hole up. We'll check each one." Grace nodded, her mind focused solely on finding Xander alive. The alternative was unthinkable. They rode through the day and into the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. By dawn, they'd reached a rugged area of sandstone formations and narrow canyons. "This is Dobbs' territory," Thornton whispered as they dismounted in a sheltered ravine. "From here, we go on foot." He detailed 2 men to stay with the horses and divided the others to approach the suspected hideout from different directions. To Grace's surprise, he assigned her to stay by his side. "I thought you'd order me to stay behind," she whispered as they crept forward. "Would you have listened?" When she shook her head, he almost smiled. "That's what I figured." They moved silently through the pre-dawn light, keeping low to the ground. As they crested a small rise, Thornton pointed to a cabin nestled against a cliff face, smoke rising from its chimney. "There," he murmured. "That's the most likely place." Grace's heart pounded as she spotted two men standing guard outside. "How do we get past them?" Before Thornton could answer, a gunshot rang out from the other side of the canyon. One of Thornton's men had been spotted. "So much for the quiet approach," Thornton muttered, drawing his pistol. "Stay down and stay behind me." What followed was chaos. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Thornton's men engaged the outlaws. Grace pressed herself against a boulder, fighting panic as bullets whizzed overhead. When there was a lull in the shooting, she risked peering around the rock. The two guards outside the cabin were down, and Thornton's men were advancing cautiously. "Now's our chance," Thornton hissed, grabbing her arm. "We'll circle around to the back while they're distracted." They scrambled down the slope, keeping to the shadows. At the rear of the cabin, they found a small window, its shutters hanging loose. "I'll go first," Thornton whispered, preparing to hoist himself up. "No," Grace countered. "I'm smaller and quieter. And if Xander's hurt, I need to assess him immediately." Before Thornton could protest, she'd pulled herself up to the window and slipped inside, landing softly in what appeared to be a storage room. She could hear voices in the main part of the cabin, angry, urgent voices debating whether to flee or fight. Pressing her ear to the door, Grace counted at least 3 different speakers. There was no mention of Xander, which sent fear coursing through her. Was he even here? Was he still alive? A soft scratching at the window announced Thornton's arrival. He joined her silently, gesturing for her to stay behind him as he eased the door open a crack. In the main room, 3 men were arguing while loading weapons. Of Xander, there was no sign. Thornton motioned for Grace to stay put, then slipped through the door. She watched in astonishment as he sauntered into the room as if he'd been invited. "Morning, gentlemen," he drawled, his pistol held casually at his side, the outlaw's world, guns raised. "I wouldn't," Thornton advised mildly. "My men have this place surrounded and I'm getting mighty tired of bloodshed." "Thornton," the tallest outlaw spat, "what the hell are you doing here?" "Looking for a deputy," Thornton replied. "I believe you borrowed him." The men exchanged glances. "What's a lawman to you?" the tall one asked suspiciously. "Let's just say I owe him a favor," Thornton replied. "Now, where is he?" After a tense moment, the outlaw jerked his head toward a trapdoor in the floor. "Cellar. Not much good to anyone now, though." Grace's blood ran cold. She pushed through the door, ignoring Thornton's warning gesture. "What did you do to him?" The outlaws looked startled at her appearance. "Who the hell is she?" "The deputy's fiancée," Thornton answered before Grace could speak. "And a doctor who's patched up men with worse injuries than anything you've doled out." He turned to Grace. "Go check on him. We'll handle things here." Grace didn't need to be told twice. She lifted the trapdoor to find a steep ladder descending into darkness. Without hesitation, she climbed down. The cellar was dank and cold, lit only by what little daylight filtered through the open trapdoor. As her eyes adjusted, Grace made out a figure slumped against the far wall. "Xander," she called softly, moving toward him. A groan answered her. Grace rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. In the dim light, she could see that his face was bruised and bloodied, worse than after his confrontation with Thornton. His hands were bound behind him and his breathing was labored. "Grace," he mumbled, disbelief in his voice. "Am I dreaming?" "No," she whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face as she worked to untie his bonds. "I'm here. We're going to get you out." "How did you find me?" he asked as his hands came free. "Long story," she replied, quickly examining his injuries. He had broken ribs, numerous cuts and bruises, and possibly a concussion, but nothing immediately life-threatening. "Can you stand?" Xander nodded, though he grimaced in pain as she helped him to his feet. "Our wedding," he remembered suddenly. "What day is it?" "Still today, for a few more hours," Grace assured him with a watery smile. "Though I think we might have to postpone." "Not on your life," Xander replied, leaning heavily on her. "I made a promise to meet you at the altar today, and I aim to keep it." Above them, the confrontation appeared to have ended peacefully. Thornton's voice called down. "Everything all right down there? We're coming up," Grace answered. "He's hurt but alive." With Thornton's help, they managed to get Xander up the ladder and outside, where the rest of the outlaws had been subdued by Thornton's men. "Thornton," Xander acknowledged weakly, "never thought I'd be glad to see your face." "Don't get used to it, Kincaid," the rancher replied gruffly. "Just didn't want to miss the satisfaction of seeing you married off." As they made their way slowly back to the horses, Grace supported Xander while Thornton led the captured outlaws. It was an unlikely alliance, but Grace found herself grateful for the rancher's help. "Why did you really do this?" She asked him quietly while Xander rested. Thornton was silent for a long moment before answering. "My wife died 10 years ago. Fever took her while I was away on business." His face was impassive, but Grace could hear the pain beneath his words. "I'd give anything to have been there, to have had a chance to say goodbye. I wouldn't wish that regret on anyone." Grace didn't know how to respond to this unexpected vulnerability from a man she'd considered an enemy. "Thank you," she said simply. Thornton nodded once, then turned away to check on the prisoners. The journey back to Stockton was slow due to Xander's injuries, but he insisted they continue through the night. "I'm not missing my own wedding," he declared whenever Grace suggested stopping to rest. They arrived in town just as dawn was breaking on what should have been their wedding day. The townspeople, who had been anxiously awaiting news, erupted in cheers when they saw the returning party, Dr. Wilson, who had returned from Kansas City upon hearing of the sheriff's injury, examined Xander thoroughly. "Broken ribs, bruised kidney, mild concussion," he confirmed Grace's assessment. "He needs bed rest for at least a week." After the wedding, Xander insisted from the examination table, Dr. Wilson looked to Grace, who shrugged helplessly. "He's very stubborn." "So I see," the doctor replied dryly. "Well, I suppose he can stand long enough to say his vows, but then straight to bed, doctor's orders." The wedding proceeded that afternoon as planned, though with some adjustments. Instead of the church, the ceremony was held in Martha's cabin, with Xander seated in a comfortable chair. Grace wore her finished wedding dress, a simple cream-colored gown with lace trim that Martha had begun and Mrs. Holloway had completed. The cabin was crowded with well-wishers, and to everyone's surprise, Silas Thornton stood quietly at the back, hat in hand. When Grace caught his eye, he nodded once in acknowledgement. As the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xander pulled Grace down for a gentle kiss. "I told you I'd be back in time," he whispered. "Never doubted it for a moment," she replied, her smile belying the worry of the past days. That evening, with Xander finally resting in what was now their bed, Grace moved about the cabin lighting the lanterns as darkness fell. When she returned to the bedroom, she found him watching her, his eyes soft with affection. "You don't have to keep them all lit," he said, patting the space beside him. "I'm right here." Grace settled next to him, careful of his injuries. "I know, but old habits die hard." "I meant what I said," Xander murmured, taking her hand. "I'll keep the lantern lit forever if that's what you need." "Just having you here makes the darkness less frightening," Grace admitted, "though I don't think I'll ever truly enjoy it." "Then we'll always have light," he promised, kissing her palm. "And not just lanterns. We'll have stars and fireflies in summer, the harvest moon in fall, snow-reflecting moonlight in winter, and sunrises all year round." As if to underscore his words, the first snow of the season began falling outside their window, the moonlight catching each flake in a brief, glittering dance. "I never thought I'd find this," Grace whispered, resting her head carefully on his shoulder. "A home, a purpose, you." "I've been waiting for you my whole life," Xander replied. "I just didn't know it until you stepped off that stage and into the middle of a gunfight." Grace laughed softly. "Not the most romantic first meeting." "I don't know about that," he countered. "I got to play the hero you patched me up." "Seems like a fine start to me." They fell silent, watching the snow through the window, the room warm and bright around them. Grace thought of all the dark nights she'd endured during the war after losing her sister when she'd received news of Martha's death. The darkness had always seemed like a void, an absence, a thing to fear. But here, with Xander's steady heartbeat beneath her ear and the gentle glow of the lantern casting soft shadows across the walls, she understood something new. Darkness wasn't the enemy. It was simply the canvas upon which light painted its most beautiful pictures, the flicker of a flame, the gleam in a loved one's eyes, the promise of dawn after the longest night. "What are you thinking about?" Xander asked, his voice drowsy with approaching sleep. "Light," she answered truthfully. "And how it only matters because of the darkness," he smiled, his eyes already closing. "That's profound, Mrs. Kincaid, very profound indeed." Grace extinguished all but one lantern before returning to bed, curling carefully against her husband's side. As sleep claimed her, she felt safer than she had since childhood, knowing that whatever darkness might come, they would face it together, lantern in hand. In the years that followed, the Kincaids became pillars of the Stockton community. Xander eventually became sheriff when his predecessor retired, bringing a new sense of justice and fairness to the position. Grace established a proper clinic, training several local girls in nursing skills and midwifery. Their family grew with the birth of twin boys, Matthew and James, followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Martha, after Grace's cousin who had unknowingly brought them together. Their home, which Xander built on a hill overlooking the town, was known for always having a light burning in the window, a beacon for travelers and townsfolk alike. Silas Thornton, to everyone's surprise, became an unlikely ally. The experience of helping rescue Xander seemed to have softened something in the rancher. He funded the town's first proper school building and was often seen delivering books for its library. Though never close friends with the Kincaids, he maintained a respectful relationship with them until his peaceful passing 15 years later. The tradition of the lit lantern continued throughout their lives. Even in summer, when the days were long and night fell late, Xander would light a lamp in their bedroom before Grace retired. It became such a habit that their children never questioned it, accepting it as simply part of their family's routine. Only once did Matthew, their curious firstborn, ask about it. "Why do you always light Mama's lamp, Pa, even when it's not fully dark?" The 10-year-old inquired one evening. Xander glanced at Grace, who smiled and nodded for him to explain. "Because a long time ago, before you were born, your mama told me she was afraid of the dark," he answered, ruffling the boy's hair. "And I promised I'd keep a lantern lit for her forever." "Are you still afraid of the dark, Mama?" Matthew asked. Grace considered the question thoughtfully. "Not in the same way," she finally replied. "The light reminds me that your father keeps his promises. That's something far more precious than just keeping shadows away." On their 25th wedding anniversary, the town of Stockton held a celebration in their honor. By then, the railroad had come through, bringing growth and prosperity. The wild days of bank robberies and outlaw gangs had largely passed into history, though old-timers still told tales of Xander's daring rescue by his nurse bride-to-be. At the celebration, held in the town square under a canopy of paper lanterns, Mayor Wilson, formerly Dr. Wilson, raised a toast. "To Sheriff and Mrs. Kincaid," he proclaimed, "who taught us all that courage isn't about not having fears, it's about facing them together with a light to guide the way." Later that night, as they walked home beneath a sky brilliant with stars, Xander took Grace's hand, his touch as familiar and necessary to her as breathing. "Happy anniversary, my love," he said softly. 25 years, Grace marveled. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday we met." "And sometimes it feels like I've loved you forever," Xander replied. "Like there was never a time when you weren't part of me." At home, their children had prepared a surprise, hundreds of small candles lighting the path to their door, transforming the darkness into a glittering wonderland. "Oh," Grace breathed, tears filling her eyes at the beauty of it. "I may have mentioned your fondness for light," Xander admitted with a smile. "The children wanted to do something special. As they stood surrounded by the gentle glow of so many flames, Grace turned to the man who had kept his promise for a quarter-century. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered. "Not when I'm with you." Xander's arms encircled her, strong and sure as they had been since that first day in Stockton. "I'll still keep the lantern lit," he promised. "Some traditions are worth keeping." And he did, every night for the rest of their long and happy lives together. Even in their twilight years, when their children had children of their own and Stockton had grown into a proper city with electric streetlights, Xander Kincaid still lit a lantern for his Grace each evening before bed. It stood as a testament not to fear, but to a promise kept a small, steady flame against the vastness of the dark, much like their love had been. A reminder that even the smallest light can hold the night at bay if only you believe in its power to do so, and in the end, isn't that what love is? A light we carry for each other through the darkness, never extinguished, never dimmed, burning eternal.